Hello and welcome to this is our final DEY dialogue, discussions in defense of childhood. My name is Denisha Jones, and I serve as the executive director of Defending the Early Years. And as you may have heard, we are shutting down operations next month, so we're making this our final dialogue. And I'm really excited to have my colleague and co-researcher and co-author, one from our team of three, join us for this discussion. Welcome, Dr. Brianne Kramer, who is a tenured faculty, sorry, I forgot the word, assistant professor at Southern Utah University, right? Did I get that right?
Associate professor. Yeah.
Associate. Okay, that's what I was missing. It's like, what's the word for? I know you got the tenure, so what's the word? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for joining. So this is a different conversation where normally I'm interviewing the person about it, but we wrote this article together with our third colleague from our team, Clint Broadbent, who's also a associate professor at Southern Utah University. So I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about the work, and then Bree will jump in. And so it's not I am asking her questions, but I'm also giving input because this was the work that we did together. And we're talking about moral injury in teachers, which is the latest article that the three of us published. When you find this recording online, there'll be a link to it, to the article. It's on a free, accessible journal called Workplace, a journal for academic labor, and it's called The Intensification of Moral Injuries in Moral Injury in Teachers during the pandemic. So let's start, how did this all came about? It's 2020. The pandemic was like upending everything we knew about teaching and learning. And my colleagues that I mentioned, Bree and Clint, and I began asking a simple but urgent question. What is actually happening to teachers right now? Right. So the first wave of our study, we ended up doing a two-phased mixed method study, meaning we collected, quantitative data through surveys and some measurable scales, and then also qualitative data through written responses, focus groups, and interviews. And so for the phase one, we were focused on how teachers had adapted to the sudden shift to remote learning in the spring of 2020, and then the reopening of schools in 2020 for the 2020-2021 school year. So it was December 2020. We created a survey that over a little over 1,000 teachers filled out, and then we conducted interviews, 21 individual interviews. And what we found was really sobering, right? So we asked teachers a lot of questions, and what we saw more and more was that there was a lot of issues around reopening and all that, but it was really the impact it was having on teachers' mental health, burnout, stress. So that became the focus for wave two of our study. We wanted to specifically look at those measures. And so we did another survey, this time over almost 4,000 teachers participated in that survey. And it was it measured three things: burnout, mental health, and stress. We used measures that were already established in the field for that with our quantitative collaborator or partner on this, Clint, who used these scales for that. Then we had a qualitative questionnaire where we asked people to like respond, like, are you feeling burnt out? Yes, no, and then give us an example. So that gave us even more information. Almost 200 people did that. And then we had focus groups and interviews. So I think the focus groups were around 35 folks, nine focus groups, with around 37 people, and then 25 semi-structured interviews for that second part. So needless to say, we had a ton of data. We had all this data. We were looking at it. We saw a lot about the issues around stress, mental health, and burnout. And then this concept of moral injury was brought to us. So I'm going to turn it over to Bree to talk about how the concept of moral injury came into our work and what we found when we started to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Denisha. So I think it was in one of the second wave individual interviews that I was doing with one sole participant. We were about halfway through a set of questions and we were starting to move into talking a little bit more about burnout. And I asked the question, which was phrased, "How are you experiencing burnout?" And I visibly watched over Zoom as the participant kind of recoiled to that question a little bit physically and took a deep breath and then said, "I'm not burned out. What I would term it as is moral injury." And I jotted that term down and I said, I was not familiar with that term at the time. I had never heard of it before. And just the weight of that term seemed very impactful to that participant. She kind of identified how she felt morally injured. And from there, Denisha, Clint, and I moved forward and kind of looking at that in terms of coding some of these responses that we initially believed were burnout, but really what teachers were defining was moral injury. And so the definitions that we have settled on come from different parts of literature that surround moral injury. It's been studied widely. I mean, the first studies about moral injury really focused on those folks who are in military service and how they have experienced moral injury during their time working in the service. We've seen some of those studies expand to healthcare workers, especially during the pandemic, which seems very interesting, especially given the data that we were able to find about teachers and comparing that with healthcare workers and some of those shared experiences that both groups of career workers have had. And it's since been expanding out into like licensed social workers, teachers. I heard the term used towards higher education workers the other day. And so this term that I was very unfamiliar with in 2022 has really started to push its way more into our everyday language as more people start to learn what it is. And so our guiding definition that we've been using as we research and code and engage with this idea more is having psychological, biological, or social impacts because a person acts in a manner that violates their beliefs about what is right or wrong. And there's a variety of emotions that have been identified that people can experience, such as guilt, shame, disgust, or anger. But regardless of the emotion, it creates some type of emotional distress that makes people avoid specific circumstances, or it creates triggers that remind them of specific experiences where they felt like their own morals were violated by others in some way. And so that's the general definition that we have been utilizing. And it really did align with how that first participant identified her aspects of moral injury in a very detailed manner during our interview.
Yeah, yeah, I remember when we talked about it because we did some interviews together and then we did interviews separate and then we would have meetings to talk about the interviews and stuff. And when you first told me and we were like, what? Like it was just such a like, wow, right? This term is out there. And then I remember and I think, we cite her a lot, right? Dora Santoro and her work on demoralization, right? And like teachers being demoralized and not being able to like achieve, right? The idea that like teaching is a moral work, right? It's not just like a job that you just do, like it's usually a calling, right? And people need to like think about that. You're called to teach, right? And for most people, not everyone, but most people, right? They're called into the profession. And so if it's a moral calling and you can no longer access the moral rewards of that work because of policies, right, or demands or whatever, then you're demoralized, right? You're unable to do that. And then connecting that to the moral injury, what I think was really helpful as we then
Mhm.
went back and looked at the data again, right? Now we're looking at it through that lens and we can see specific incidences of how what people were describing was that, right? And so again, we started looking out at burnout, right? Can you talk about why that became so problematic, right? That we had to look at something like the issue, why is it not just burnout?
Yeah, it's not just burnout because burnout is really and this is what the that initial participant shared and I rightfully agree with her description is that burnout first of all, it's an overused term. It's sort of putting blame onto that person as if they are burned out because they didn't set enough boundaries, that they didn't have enough self-care, that they didn't do all
Yeah.
of these things that are supposed to protect them. When in reality, moral injury is forced upon someone. So burnout might actually result from things that you can control. You can control how many assignments you give students, which might lead to burnout because you have a high grading load, right? But you can't control things like lack of parental support. You can't control things like the teacher accountability measures that your state uses or the standardized testing that's forced upon students that teachers are required to administer. We can't have any effect on the autonomy that we're not allowed to have in the teaching profession, right? That our administrators, that legislators, that those in power hold from us as teachers. And so that's really where burnout and moral injury differ, is that burnout can somewhat, and most of the time, if you look at the literature, can be controlled in certain circumstances. But moral injury is a structural or an institutional issue. And one person or a group of people is not going to be able to change that entire structure or institution in general.
Yeah, yeah. And that's such an important point, right? Because it's beyond your control, where burnout is like, it's all the onus is on you to figure it out, get it together. But this is important, right? Because it's not something that you have control over, right? The situation is, beyond you, but that doesn't mean that there can't be repair to the injury, right? So we have a book coming out. This is it, guys, with this COVID research. We've been in this trenches since 2020. 6 years now. We've published several articles, book chapters, but we are co-authoring collectively, the three of us, a book that we hope will be out this year with Myers Press, really on the lessons we learned from our COVID research. And so we do have a chapter in there on moral injury, and that's where, and you like, we all wrote different chapters. So Bree wrote this chapter, and that's where you talk about four pathways, right, to repairing the injury, saving the profession. So you talk about resistance as moral repair, institutional accountability, pedagogical repair, and moral resilience, right? And I'm doing this series in my consulting work about like embracing early childhood values as resistance. And it really came from this moral resistance and resistance as moral repair ideas in those chapters that we have to like work, because those are things we can do, right? We can resist, right? In terms of institutional accountability, that requires, right, changes structurally, systems, policies, and those sorts of things. And we make recommendations in the book for that. But I think about individual teachers, like what can they do to kind of to repair the injury and to like save themselves? Because what we saw is like so many teachers were leaving the profession, right? In that second phase of our study. How many times did we have teachers reach out and say, "Oh, I don't know if I can participate in an interview because I quit." And we're like, "It's okay. We'll take you anyway." But that was like a theme popping up, like
Yeah.
to the end where like a good percentage of our teachers were not actually
Yeah.
teaching anymore when we interviewed them, because they had already, and then the rest were talking about walking away if they could, waiting for retirement and things like that. So we know if nothing changes, then many teachers are going to leave the profession because they can't they can't stay in these working conditions. So if you can talk a little bit about those pathways that you named in the forthcoming book chapter.
Yeah, I think first it's really important for us to connect how we talked a little bit about how we found out about moral injury in terms of that participant, but I think that we need to understand how much the pandemic was a catalyst for moral injury for teachers. Because that is when I believe it's not like teachers weren't aware of the aspects of their job, right? Some of those things that I had already shared. We have a
Hmm.
list in our chapter of things that we consider moral injury. And it's not that teachers didn't know that they didn't have control over those things prior to that. But I think the pandemic just magnified this for so many
Yes.
teachers and really indicated to them that in many cases, what we heard, the input that districts were asking for was ignored. It wasn't used. Teachers were scapegoated by being honest and answering, administrators' questions or administrative surveys about their feelings about going back to work or their thoughts about what the next school year should look like structurally. And so I think that time period that we were studying just really was such an important shift. And I think that is why the themes that we came up with are just really most important. And I think the most important of those is that idea of resistance. Um, I know we're talking about early childhood, K-12 education, but just education as a whole, preschool through, college education, university level education. Moral injury is plaguing every educator at every level. And the only way that this is going to shift, the only way to shift systems, the only way to shift institutions is through resistance. And it's going to take a massive resistance in order to make the shifts and force the shifts that we need to see happen at the different levels of education. That's going to look a little different, perhaps at the early childhood level than it does at the university level. But there needs to be specific shifts made. And so teachers, I think, have been really good about organizing, utilizing their unions, forcing actions, especially in the last couple of years. I think, influenced by the wave of the red state strikes in 2018.
Hmm.
We've seen what happens and the power when educators rise up and say, we're not doing this. We're committing educational malpractice against our students, against our community, against our school, and who put their trust in us to properly educate and advocate for their children and the community's children. And so I think that is really kind of what we need to tap back into are those like grassroots movements, utilizing unions, but also utilizing those outside of unions as well, in order to really push this change. It does have to be everyone that is participating in
Yes.
this. It can't just be one small group. It's not going to work that way. It has to be a unified effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's super important. And you mentioned that in the chapter, and like we share that, like you can't do this in isolation. It used to be like, oh, just close your door and keep teaching and do it. But we know that doesn't work right now. There are accountability systems to get teachers pushed out of the classroom for doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it's not enough to just go in your classroom and shut the door, right? I have a friend that I went to college with. She was a long-term public school teacher, amazing middle school literacy teacher, won awards for her work in literacy in middle schoolers, and then the district's evaluation system got her kicked out of her school.
Mhm.
Right. So again, it didn't matter that she was doing all this great work in her classroom and like really, really helping families and children learn, can engage in reading and become critical readers. That system was in place and it put her out. And then, she went on and do other things, but still like, so you can't just shut your door and work in isolation. You have to work in community. Now, had there been like a coalition of educators to kind of like resist these things, it's super important. And everyone's like, oh, we're post pandemic, don't bring that up again. But again, the pandemic just exacerbated what was already there. And what's going to be the next thing, right? Will it be another global pandemic or will it just be some other thing? Right now, it might be AI and data centers, right? Really threatening the future of public education. But whatever it is, we know it's going to be something. And if we don't learn from anything from COVID, then we're just going to like continue to put a lot of pressure on, on schools and education where the foundation is falling apart, right? And so if you just keep putting stuff on top with a rocky foundation, it's all going to crumble. It's all going to fall apart. And so I think this idea of resistance is super important, but collaborative, collective resistance is super important as well too.
And I mean, I'm going to flip back that
Mhm.
neoliberal term accountability to, the folks who are pushing it onto educators. We need to have institutional accountability. We need to have
Yes,
partnerships
yes,
at these various levels in order to support our educators. I can hear my graduate students in my ear right now saying, "Okay, yes, we need to organize. Yes, we need to resist. But like, what does that look like institutionally, right? Because that's what we work in."
yeah.
And so we need administrators we need administrators to do this work with us.
Mhm.
Administrators have to be adopting things like trauma-informed leadership. They have to be thinking about frameworks that are rooted in moral repair. And so restorative justice movements, restorative justice practices are already utilized in some schools, but not all schools and not enough schools. And so
Yeah.
when we have teachers that are consistently, as we saw in our study, describing and identifying teaching as if they were part of an abusive relationship, that's what many
Hmm.
people
Yeah.
likened teaching to, that being in an
Hmm.
abusive relationship and not being able to leave. Like, how is that the way that we're talking about our profession that we dreamed of most of us dreamed of going into, since we were children?
Yeah.
There needs to be a constant and consistent reframing. And part of that's going to be that accountability. So districts have to look at those processes. They have to implement those processes. Administrators have to utilize them as well and work in tandem with teachers. Teachers and administrators should not be enemies. They should be
Yeah.
working together because we are all there for the central premise of educating our students and wanting to move them into the next level of knowledge as students, gain knowledge from preschool all the way up through 12th grade, maybe past then if they choose to go on. We want our students to graduate and be knowledgeable and have that great education that we've been able to provide them at all levels. And we can't do that when there's battles within the environment amongst the people who are supposed to be doing that work with students. And so some of that's going to need to center around healing, empathy, justice work that's implemented in schools. And I know those are not popular terms right now. I know a lot of schools that, I'm in Utah, there's a lot of schools here that have um, started to eliminate the socio-emotional learning programs for students because of a lot of the negative backlash and press that and false ideas that people
Mhm.
claim that they're promoting. But we need to think about more framing the school itself, framing all decisions of the school in frameworks such as that, because it's not just something that we should be teaching our students. It's something we all should be implementing and utilizing daily in our work with colleagues and our work with parents, not just in what we're teaching our students. And so I think that's the other piece is we keep doing add-ons in education. Like
Mhm.
we have this base level and it's like, well, we'll add this on and then we'll add this on. And then we get surprised when things happen, like, the anti-DEI push, and they start stripping that out. Well, it's really easy for them to just remove something that's been added on. But if we
Yeah.
ingrain it in the framework, if we recreate that framework, and we can do that at a district level, we can do that at a school level. Like we don't have to do, tackle it as a society based level first. We can do that, in just one school first. Like you can do that in your school, work with your administrators, right? Um, and really kind of force that change to happen and ingrain that into something that cannot be taken apart. I think that's really the other thing that we saw during the pandemic is all of these things that have been added on, different curriculums, different programs, different things that were supposed to be beneficial are now all getting stripped away. And it's just because they were additions. They never became foundational. They never became frameworked and ingrained into that the way that they really should have been from the beginning. And so I think all of those aspects are things that we all can take part in, teachers, parents, students, administrators, legislators, like everyone who's a stakeholder in education can take part in recreating what that looks like. And it sounds like a big undertaking, and I know it is, but it really can be, starting to work in one school. We don't have to tackle the entire societal system at one time, although that would be great if we could do that. But that's, obviously a very lofty
Yeah,
goal.
yeah,
So.
absolutely, absolutely. No, and that's great because I think it's important and it shows that like, yeah, start small, focus on your school, get your school on board, and then, branch out, right, into the rest of the schools in your district and then moving to another district, right, and that sort of thing. But I really love the point you made about how it's easy to get rid of add-ons because it was just an add-on. It wasn't integrated fully into the system, right? And so we see that happening. But I think also we've seen examples just recently. We know that education is under attack by the current administration, starting with the Department of Education, right? But like we've seen some districts show what institutional accountability looks like and by resistance,
Mhm.
right? Like so there was
Right.
that point where the current administration was demanding all schools cease with DEI and all of this stuff. And a few districts put out public letters saying, yeah, no. Yeah, no, we're not doing that, right? That's the kind of institutional accountability because then what happened? Those laws that the current administration tried to pass were struck down. They went to
Right.
court and sued and they won. You
Right.
cannot force schools to stop doing diversity, equity, inclusion because it is a framework of education, right? And so
Right.
you can't, right? So people were just capitulating early. They were like, okay, fine, we'll pull it
Mhm.
out. No, hold the line because in the end of the day, that didn't pass. The president can't just come and
Right.
force schools to stop caring about diversity, equity, and inclusion because they think it's wrong, right? Like that's not how
Yeah.
this really works. And so for those school districts that said no and put out public statements, right, that was
Mhm.
great. That was what we needed. And that's what teachers needed to see, right? We're not going to just stop doing all this work we're doing because the current administration doesn't believe in it, right? Like you
Right.
have to,
Yeah.
education has always had to be protected from the whims of the political climate, which will come in and
Mhm.
just shift around and shift. Education can't be shifting in the winds with the rest of y'all. We have to have something that
Right.
grounds us no matter who is in charge, right? And so that's one of the things that I think are super important and just an example, right, of how this works as well, too.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming in and having this conversation. Again, I mentioned our article is in the Workplace, a journal for academic labor, and the most current issue. We actually, me and Bree and two of our other
Mhm.
colleagues, co-edited two special issues out of Workplace, and this article was in the second one. We invite you to look at them. The series was called Teaching in Contentious Times, and so we had two issues. That's how many articles we got submitted when we did a call for that, and they're really great
Mhm.
articles about how teachers have been experienced. There's one on I see teachers, but I think the first issue had one on social work,
It
or was that
did.
the second
Hmm.
issue? Yeah,
Yeah.
social workers as well too. So not just educators, but social worker came up as well too. Um, but we encourage you to take a look at those, and then yeah, I'll also share links. Like I said, I did a workshop on this when the article came out, and I'm happy to offer it again. Put that information as well when we share today, Bree. And thank you guys all so much for supporting us. And we look forward to keep supporting you in the work that you're doing.
Thank you.